Hello everybody, Noah here with Learn Meta-Analysis. In this video, we're going to be talking about data extraction and coding. So let's go ahead and get started. In this video, we're going to cover a couple different things, and by the end of it, you should be able to identify how to choose what data to extract from primary studies, identify how data extraction techniques vary depending upon the type of review you're conducting, and last but not least, identify various ways to approach setting up a coding form. So let's go through each one of these things, and the first question that I'm often asked is, how do I know what to code, right? It's kind of a loaded question, but let me give you some examples. First and foremost, regardless of the type of review, we usually have some sort of descriptive information. This is the information that gives us some background and tells us about the nature of the sample. So this would often be like the publication year or the type of publication that it was, whether it was a journal article, conference proceeding, or a book chapter. The next thing that we want to do is think about our research questions, and we want to make sure that we extract relevant data, or I'm going to call them variables from time to time. We want to make sure that we are extracting data or variables that help us actually answer each research question. And I know this seems really obvious, but especially when we're just starting with systematic reviews, it's really easy to code a bunch of stuff and then realize later that it doesn't actually answer your research questions. So it's another one of those areas where good planning is going to help you. So what I like to do personally is set up my research questions and then identify, actually structure out my coding form to see which variables are going to inform each research question to make sure that I have everything there that I need. Next, we should look at the theory in our field. Generally speaking, if we're conducting a meta-analysis, for example, or even a systematic review, things that might moderate the effects tend to need to be theory-driven, at least in my area of work. We generally want to see theory-driven variables that are potential moderators or things that we're examining to see if they moderate the effects. So one question that I get asked frequently is, are exploratory variables okay? And personally, I have mixed feelings on this approach. My overall perception is, or I should say my overall opinion, is super vague in that I'm going to say it depends, right? So I say it depends because with something like a scoping review, we're trying to describe our sample. So it's not really exploratory in the sense that we're not looking to see what's impacting our outcomes, for example, like we might in a systematic review or meta-analysis, but it is exploratory in the sense of we're trying to get a grasp on what's going on in that field so that we can properly describe it. So now let's talk a little bit about meta-analysis, which is the opposite end of the spectrum, where we are actually trying to quantitatively say that something does or doesn't have an impact on whatever outcome. So in this case, I personally feel, and this is a reflection of the field, I personally feel that we should have a good rationale for examining specific moderators most of the time. However, there are a number of cases where exploratory analyses I think are okay, as long as we are able to say why we are doing it, and we openly acknowledge that these are exploratory, and we rationalize why we actually need these exploratory analyses. So I can give you a little example of this, of where I've used this in my own work, or at least how I've thought about it in terms of my own work. So I've mentioned in other videos that I typically research virtual characters. And in this area, we have rather vague theories that say things like social cues can influence learning. And we don't necessarily know how, and we don't really specify which social cues on those high-level theories. So from my perspective, it's okay to have some exploratory variables because we can track them back, or I should say we should be able to track them back to these social cues. So if we're looking at things that are social cues in relation to the agent design, I can tie that back to my theory that says social cues are important. So it's exploratory in the sense that the theory doesn't specify this particular social cue as being important, but nobody's analyzed it, so it makes sense that we should analyze it, being that it is a type of social cue. And our theories are saying that social cues influence learning. Okay, so let's move on. Let's take a look at a couple of examples and we'll see what we might want to code for each one. First and foremost, how about an example scoping review? And this could be on the effects of pedagogical agents' impact on learning. Again, pedagogical agent is simply a virtual character. So the overarching research question for this study might be something like, what is the nature of evidence around pedagogical agents' impact on learning? So we're just trying to understand what the field looks like. So the first thing that I like to code is data about the publication itself. This is descriptive. Often includes the year it is published and the publication type, like I mentioned earlier. Was it a journal article? Was it a book chapter, a dissertation, etc.? Next, we might have a research question. So let me go back and preface this a little bit. Each one of these higher level bullet points like publication data and study design information, each one of these would be a research question in my mind. So we have this overarching research question at the top: what is the nature of evidence? And then I would have a sub question about each one of these things. So my first question would be something to the effect of when are these studies being published and where? And that's going to get us at our publication data. My second one might be what types of studies are being conducted, and that's going to get us at some of these next variables, such as what type of randomization or assignment strategy did they use? Was it an individual or collaborative task, etc.? My next question might be about how the actual agents or characters were designed, and I might code things like if they use gestures and what types. I might look at things like their overall appearance, were they a humanoid or non-humanoid character, and a variety of other variables as well. Last but not least, I would probably record some outcome information because I want to know what types of learning have been investigated and how. So I might be looking at things like the type of test, and when I say the type of test, I mean things like retention or transfer or some sort of performance assessment. And we may also be interested in, was this a multiple choice test, a true-false test, etc. Okay, so now let's think a little bit about a systematic review. If we run with this same overall idea of sticking with pedagogical agents' impact on learning, with a systematic review, we might be interested in how their design specifically impacts learning. So whereas with our scoping review, we might have included studies that looked at characters versus no character, as well as characters of different designs. In this specific review, we might be looking at only studies that compared characters of different designs to one another. So our overall question: how should we design pedagogical agents to be more effective for learning, or I should say to be effective for learning? Well, first, we're going to have the same sort of descriptive data, right? This is going to describe our sample and help contextualize whatever we find. So we have similar data here as what we would have extracted for the others. Next, again, we're going to have similar information about study design because these things can presumably influence the results, right? What type of randomization or assignment did they use? Was it an individual task or a collaborative task? All of these things could influence how we design the agent. And then we're going to get into what I would call like the really important part of this study, which is the agent design information, right? That's what this whole study focuses on, is how we are actually designing agents. So we, again, might have information about gestures. Maybe we're recording simply if they were present or absent, or what we're more likely recording is if they were present, what types of gestures were being used. Again, we might have this question about the agent's appearance, and we might go further than this, though. We might have one that's, was it a humanoid or a non-humanoid? We might also have questions about the character's age, or perhaps even the clothing it's wearing, or its gender. We might also ask, how many times did learners interact with the system? Presumably, this has some influence with agent design. We might also wonder about how long was the intervention? Is this something where students worked with the agent for 10 minutes, or was it something where the students worked with the agent for 2 hours? Those are two very different contexts, and it might influence how we design our agent. Last but not least, we're going to have our outcome information, and we're going to have our outcome type here, but we're probably also going to have our results because we want to know how all of these contextual factors influence the results that we find. Okay, so last but not least, one important thing, and this is becoming increasingly important. I'm recording this video in 2024, and something that people are just now starting to talk more about in education, even though it's been talked about longer in other fields, is the question of study quality. Now, we should be examining study quality. This is something that's been very common in, for example, medicine for a longer period of time, and education's just been a little bit slow to adopt it, in my opinion. So there's a number of different measures of study quality. I don't want to go into this really in detail right now, but there's a number of different ways you can examine study quality, from existing measures through making up your own measure. I think that's going to be an entirely different video for us to discuss, because this is one of those things that's kind of like a loaded idea where there's a lot of different aspects to study quality. So when we're talking about study quality, we might be talking about risk of bias, or you might be talking about like how well things were actually measured and how interpretable the study was. So there's a number of different layers here. We can disentangle that in a future video. Okay, so now let's look at a meta-analysis example, right? So same general idea, pedagogical agents' impact on learning. And our research question here, overarching question, is going to be how do they actually influence learning? Again, we're going to have some publication data as background sort of data to help describe our sample. Again, we're going to record study design information, but this time it's going to be slightly different, right? Because we want to make sure we record what type of control group that we're actually using. Because if you recall, in a meta-analysis, we're looking at studies that compare a group with a character to a group without a character, at least in the context of this study. So if we're asking how do pedagogical agents influence learning, kind of the unsaid follow-up there is compared to no agent condition. So really with this, we'd be examining studies that compared learning with a virtual character to learning without a virtual character. So in this case, we want to make sure we record what the no virtual character condition actually was so that we can better understand our comparisons. Again, we may be interested in the randomization or assignment strategy and the type of task that it was. Again, we're going to get into agent design, right? Because we talked about the potentially moderating factors as things we want to examine. And again, we're going to have the same list of things here that we had for the systematic review. And again, recall, meta-analysis and systematic review are very similar, where the differences really come in are, number one, how you're actually coding your data and what data you're recording. Although I have a caveat to this that you can record it the same way for both meta-analysis and systematic review. It's just with systematic reviews, we don't tend to record it the exact same way. So anyway, we're coding the same variables here. Next, with outcome information, as you can see, we have the same sort of information we had for the systematic review, looking at the outcome type as well as the outcome results. Now, where this differs with meta-analysis, depending upon the approach that you're taking, and we'll talk about this in a future video, conventional versus 3-level, we're going to be recording our data in what is probably a quite different way from what we do in a systematic review. We'll talk more about this when we talk about meta-analysis, but when we talk about systematic reviews, we're often recording the data as the authors have reported it. And what I mean is something like this. If they are comparing let's just say a male virtual character to a female virtual character, they may say something like there was no difference between learning depending upon the agent's gender and give a t-test result, right? And you may just record that t-test result as the result of that study. Now, if this were a meta-analysis and we were meta-analyzing that data, instead we would probably write down the mean, standard deviations, and the sample size for each group. And the reason is because we want to calculate our own effect size for the meta-analysis, whereas that effect size is not necessarily what we want to be talking about in the context of a systematic review. In that case, we'd be looking at the overall test result, which was non-significant. Okay, so last but not least, we're going to examine study quality here, and this is for the same reasons as we would under a systematic review. Okay, so now let's talk about the coding form itself and some strategies to make this easier. So first and foremost, it's not like there's one software program you have to use. There's a lot of different options for what you can do. So personally, I like to use spreadsheets most of the time, and there's tons of different options available from Google Sheets and Excel through Numbers and SPSS, etc. All of them have different benefits and drawbacks, and it really just depends on what you need for your coding as to which one you prefer. As an example, I myself have used SPSS for a long time, but when I started working on more collaborative reviews, I switched over to Google Sheets, and I found it good for most of the things that I'm doing, although it does have some limitations, but that's content for a different conversation. Just know that each one of these things has advantages and disadvantages, so you really need to think about what you need your software to do, and then you can plan accordingly. Another option is to use forms, and what I mean by that is something like Google Forms or a survey. And so you'd have each variable essentially as a question, and then you can select, either using multiple choice or free input, what your answer is for each one of those things. And as long as that form or that survey exports the data to some sort of spreadsheet, it should work just fine. It's really a matter of what interface do you prefer working with, assuming that they both have equivalent features. So sometimes people really prefer the forms format, where it asks a question and you have multiple choice answers listed right there. Others, such as myself, prefer to have a spreadsheet format, where if I click on the box, I get a drop-down menu and I can choose which variable I need. And so my personal preference is spreadsheets most of the time, but I know other people who greatly prefer to work in forms. The result is that it really depends on you and what it is you're trying to do, because there is not really a right or wrong answer to this. Here's some key considerations for you. Number one, what type of data are you actually dealing with? Are you dealing with open-ended data, categorical data, numerical data? All of these things can be accommodated in different forms, so either using a form or a spreadsheet, but it looks a little different depending upon which one you're using. So you need to think through that kind of thing to see what your preference is. Second, what format do you need to export to, if any? And so this is important because you need to be thinking about either your data analysis software, if you're doing a meta-analysis, or how you're actually going to present that data to a reader of your manuscript when you're done, if you're doing a systematic review. So Generally speaking, personally, I prefer to use spreadsheets most of the time, as I mentioned, and I prefer to have it so I can export it as a CSV, because CSV files are what I typically use to analyze data in a variety of different software programs. But that doesn't mean that's the right answer for you. So you need to think through what it is that you're going to be doing and pick your coding form strategy appropriately. Last but not least, maybe actually the most important here, is what is the most efficient for you? Okay, and this seems very obvious, but there's nuance to this. So I mentioned earlier that spreadsheets and forms can do essentially the exact same thing. Why do I prefer spreadsheets over forms? Well, the reason is efficiency. I know what each of my variables are, and I know what the drop-down menus mean for each of those things. So I can go through a spreadsheet and mark everything that I need to mark, extract my data, much more quickly than I can do the same on a form, because when I use a form, I typically include longer descriptive information about each variable, etc. So it requires a lot more reading for me, whereas with a spreadsheet, I know all this information already. So I can go much more quickly through a spreadsheet than I can through a form. So for me, spreadsheets are often more efficient. But I know other people who are the opposite, and they prefer to have forms because it's faster for them to see their descriptions of everything right there on the form in the same place every time as they answer the question. So again, think about what is going to be most efficient for you and has all of the features that you need. So to quickly summarize, number one, your research questions provided you with probably the best starting point for identifying what data you need to extract, because you need to make sure you can answer your research questions based on the data that you extract. Otherwise, it's just an exercise in futility, basically, because you'll extract all this data that's useless. Similarly, you shouldn't extract a bunch of data that you're not going to use. There's no point to that. So your research questions should be your guide for identifying what data you're going to extract from studies. Second, different types of reviews have different types of research questions, and that means that you're probably going to extract different types of information or record that information differently depending upon the type of review that you're actually conducting. So as I mentioned before, systematic review and meta-analysis, you may record the exact same information, but the way that you record it or the details that you record about that information might be different depending upon what you're trying to do. Finally, coding forms can look a lot of different ways, okay? There's not really a right or wrong. Efficiency is going to be the key, and that is what I want you to keep in mind here. The kind of the priority list in terms of how I think. Number one, what data do I need? I write all that down in relation to each research question to make sure I actually have enough data to answer my research question. Then I look at each one of those variables and I say, what kind of data is this? Is this something that I'm categorizing? Is it open-ended, etc.? Then I think about my different software options, and I think about which ones will let me accommodate these types of data that I need. And then if I have more than one option available, I think about which one of these can I use most efficiently. Okay, so that's the checklist that I go through in my own mind as I'm starting to work through this. All right, so that pretty much summarizes our video on data extraction, and I hope you found this helpful. I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you.